So we're just going to turn it over to you, Dan. And if you have any questions, let me know.
Thank you. Yeah, good to be here, Mel. As he said, my name is Dan Kaminsky. I'm from Brooklyn originally, and now I run a company called Social Justice Tours. Social Justice Tours uses walking tours as a medium to delve into conversations about justice and equity in New York locally. So I've been doing plenty of research over the past few years about a variety of concerns. So the structure of this conversation will be that I'll talk a bit about some of the history, some information, some stories, some contexts of a concern, and then I'll kick it over to Mel, who will talk about the federal implications and also some of the policies that he's fighting for, some of the things he's working on and thinking about. So today's conversation, this is part of a series. We're going to do a couple of these talks. Today's talk is about the climate crisis. I'm hearing conversations about this idea of, quote, going back to normal. And I think we need to recognize that normal was a state of crisis. And so, whoops, I saw this meme recently, which I really appreciated, outlining the way that we were already in a state of many intersecting crises. And so moving forward, we will have to platform multiple conversations as this crisis is really putting oil or putting on fires that were already there. So as said, today we're talking about the climate crisis. I think with the climate crisis in New York, it's really easy to feel disconnected from it and feel like it's a rather esoteric issue. So I want to start just by rooting us in place, rooting us in context, and talking about some of the things that New York can expect to see over the coming decades. There are many metrics that I could theoretically use to kind of highlight what New York has in store for it. The metric I'll be using is storm surges and sea level rise, largely because it's the most well-researched. It's pretty obvious, and there's a lot of data on it. So I'll start there just to kind of anchor us in place. So I'm pulling up some numbers here. These numbers are from the NPCC. That's the New York Panel on Climate Change. Many people have heard of the IPCC. That's this is kind of the New York's counterpart. It's the most elite scientists in New York City, Columbia and NYU and the like. And every 3 years, they publish a report that informs us what we have to expect in store for the coming years. So this is their 2019 report, and this is numbers on storm surges that we can expect. The metric they're using here is the 100-year flood. So that's a storm that has a 1% chance on any given year of happening. And that's the standard measurement to measure these sorts of storms. And so their low estimate for this decade is 11.5 feet. Their worst case scenario is 20.7 feet of storm surge. That's under what they're calling the ARIM scenario. That's the Antarctic rapid ice melt scenario. That's if the Antarctic melts quicker than previously expected, right? So we're ranging this century from 11.5 feet to 20 feet. To put that into perspective, so at 5 feet of storm surge, the neighborhood Old Howard Beach is flooded. 6 feet of storm surge, Coney Island underwater. 7 feet of storm surge, Red Hook and Ellis Island underwater. JFK goes underwater at about 10 feet. Hurricane Sandy hit it at 11.5 feet. So if we look at these numbers, right, we see that 11.5 feet is our new normal. That is the type of storm that we can expect really from here on out, even by conservative estimates, which this low percentile is. So not only are these storms going to happen more intensely, but they're going to happen more frequently, right? So what was an 100-year flood is now estimated on the conservative end to happen once every 93 years. And by the end of the century, under worst case scenarios, what was a flood that would happen once every 100 years can now happen on any given day, right? That there's a possibility for any day to have that sort of storm. And indeed, under the worst case scenarios, the high tides will be equivalent to what Hurricane Sandy brought, right? The storm surges that Hurricane Sandy brought will be equivalent to just daily high tides throughout the city under worst case. Moving on to sea level rise. This is same source, NPCC, looking at their over the coming decade, right, anywhere from about 1/5 of a foot to a foot, and by the end of the century, about 10 feet of sea level rise, which would be rather catastrophic, right? So to give you a visual idea of what this looks like, Climate Central put out this map, which I really appreciate, to have you see visually what this means. So on the right side of the screen here is 1.5 degrees of warming. So the context there is that's our goal. That's the best case scenario. That's what the Paris Climate Accords are trying to get us to, or keep us under. We know that one of the first actions our current president did was pull us out of Paris, and it's becoming increasingly unlikely that we're going to be able to keep it under 1.5 degrees. And on the left side of the screen is 4 degrees of warming, which is a pretty severe set of circumstances. So just to kind of move around the city, and I encourage people to go to this website, I can drop it in the chat later. We see that even under best case scenarios, the Far Rockaways are essentially totally underwater. Coney Island, southern Brooklyn are underwater. Western Brooklyn, parts of Western Queens, within our district, parts of Flushing there, and some of the edges of Manhattan are underwater, right? This is a pretty unavoidable set of circumstances. If we're already looking on the left side, if we do not radically take action, essentially all of southern Brooklyn gets underwater. And this is, I'm not talking storm surge here. I hope that's clear. This is permanent inundation that we're talking about. All of southern Queens, southeastern Queens, most of western Queens, we see Long Island City and Astoria. And then Manhattan becomes essentially a sliver around Central Park there, and southern Bronx as well, and many more neighborhoods within Mel, your district. So I started there just to sort of root us in some of what New York City is going to look like moving forward. Mel, I'll kick it over to you now to kind of expand us from the hyper-local, which is what I study, to the federal context, right? What's happening around the country with climate change? What are we facing? And more specifically, you are a Green New Deal candidate. That's one of the cornerstones of your platform. So I'm hoping you could talk about what that means and why you're fighting for it.
Sure. So I'm glad you started with that meme, because we were just having this conversation earlier today. I had to do a presentation for the Cornell Progressives. And what worries me is that, you know, we have developed sort of this culture of like political hyperbole. And I think folks that have been paying attention to the climate crisis, you know, I think that language has been appropriate this entire time, but it hasn't quite resonated. And then here we are in the middle of the COVID crisis where people literally are losing their lives on a daily basis. And we have a federal government and an infrastructure, and not, you know, I'm not talking about bridges and tunnels, I'm talking about the infrastructure of governance that is so broken that it's unable to do anything about it. And so that meme is actually kind of appropriate because, you know, what we're going to see from climate change is catastrophic. I mean, I think in terms of migration, what it means from a national security perspective, what it means for our livelihoods, what it means for the future of the economy, and just to be able to, you know, even keep our homes in some instances, as you just saw on the map, right? I mean, there are even portions of Central Queens that are safe from it. And, you know, we can't forget that there's going to be, you know, there's a ripple effect from the catastrophes that we could potentially see there. And so I'm alarmed, and that's why, you know, I do support the Green New Deal. Now, for folks that, you know, may not be familiar with it, really what the Green New Deal is a framework, right? It doesn't force Congress to act on any particular thing. It just says, you know, sort of these are the broad goals that we think we need to address in order to mitigate, you know, the negative effects of climate change. And I think many are rightfully concerned that we aren't moving fast enough. And that's like you know, one of the big things when we're talking about the Green New Deal is making sure that we're talking about not just supporting the framework, but that, you know, once in office, what we want to be working on are specific pieces of legislation that'll take portions of this framework and operationalize it into something that's real. Because it is going to take a mass mobilization to address the urgency of what we're facing, and a restructuring of our economy. And, you know, and I understand that some people might, you know, sort of be wary of that. But, you know, that's why we do need policymakers in place that are forward thinking, that aren't taking this seriously, that aren't just sort of, you know, sort of waiting for things to happen and start putting together, issue area experts, as well as working with members of the community, particularly frontline communities that are the first ones to face the negative effects of climate change. That's the kind of thing that, watching AOC introduce the Green New Deal for public housing, that's awesome, because it's the first time that we're seeing not just a tangible piece of legislation that'll enact a portion of the Green New Deal, but it's looking to sort of heal some of the racial disparities that we've seen traditionally when it comes to environmental justice. And so we have to start thinking about, at the federal level, when we talk about a just transition, meaning that, yes, look, the reality is that there are going to be certain industries that are no longer going to be around. We don't want to throw those folks on the street. So what do we need in terms of job training, job placement? How do we take care of those that are just so close to retirement that they're not going to start a brand new career? And these are conversations that we're not hearing, even when we do talk about the Green New Deal, because I think to a lot of people it's just like, oh, it's an environmental thing, or the environmentalists, but it's really at the intersection of all of these issues that we've been talking about and fighting for, right? I mean, I don't think you can be for the Green New Deal and also support, American imperialism, right? Because, when the American military is the largest producer of carbon than other developed nations, and that's a very real thing. And so you can't have one without the other. You have to figure out, how do we, balance this out in a way that we're not just investing in pollution, or just kind of putting our finger in the hole in the dam here so the water can spout out on the other side. So it's a matter of building both the actual infrastructure, right, like things that we talk about here in NY-6, like finishing Queens Boulevard, making sure that it's safer, investing in our public transportation so that it's free and accessible to all and reduces the number of vehicles on the streets, and all of these other different policy tools that we could put into place that make the Green New Deal no longer a framework, but something that is real, and that we can directly assign resources and start organizing and putting in place the human resources that we're going to need at the local level to implement and see some of this new infrastructure be built, see some of these new programs be created, managed, and administered to serve the entirety of the district equitably. Because as we've seen, in regardless of what policy area we're talking about, but I think that specifically when concerning the environment, because it's very easy not to think about, well, why does this road run through here? Why does this train track run through here? Why is this bus depot sited here? Right? It kind of gets lost, but then you see when at the health outcomes of minority neighborhoods, and there is through the Green New Deal in terms of incentives and funding to municipalities to be able to rework the way that that siting and zoning happens at the local level.
Wow, so that's a really remarkable transition to what I was hoping you would talk about. So you mentioned a lot about equity. You mentioned a lot about, even gave a specific example of bus depots, which I was planning to talk about. So what I'm going to pivot now to is justice, right? And specifically environmental justice. And I'll give three relatively concrete examples and then send it back to you. I was going to do a whole long history of how we got here, and instead I'll just keep it with the surface level, what there is. So the first is public health, right, which you mentioned. So I have this map here showing the health disparities throughout the city. Darker blue means lower health, lighter means longer health, longer life. And what we see here, it's summed at the bottom. It's a couple years old, and this will definitely change post-corona. But Upper East Side, Battery Park, Greenwich Village, Soho, they have 86-year life expectancy, whereas neighborhoods just a couple miles away, Brownsville, Central Harlem, Rockaways, Bed-Stuy, a full decade under, right? So think about the emphasis or the value we're placing on some lives that get to live 10 years longer than others, even though they're all in the same essential location. The next set of maps, this one on the left here, the darker the color, the higher percentage population of color in that area. And on the right, the darker the color, the lower the median income. And the red dots throughout all of these are solid waste management stations throughout New York. Now, the point here is when you combine all three maps, right? So when you combine all of those maps, what you see is that the same neighborhoods with the highest populations of color are the same lowest median income neighborhoods, which are the same lowest life expectancy neighborhoods, which are the same neighborhoods that house all of our noxious facilities, whether it's waste transfer stations or bus depots. In talking about bus depots, 75% of bus depots are housed in community of colors in New York City, right? And you think about all the idling and the noxious fumes coming from those bus depots. Waste transfer stations are the same. It's the same statistic. 75% historically of waste transfer stations were housed in just 3 neighborhoods, Southeast Queens, North Brooklyn, and South Bronx. And you think about not only the health impacts of trash in a neighborhood and all those trucks, but even the psychological effect of just a few neighborhoods housing all of this, being the stomping grounds or the garbage disposal places for the rest of the city, right? What does that do to your feeling of your neighborhood? So that's one example, right? Public health. The second example here locally is what's called SMEAs. This is much less talked about. So what a SMEA is a significant maritime industrial area, SMIA, significant maritime industrial area. What that is heavy industry that's located right on the waterfront. And the risk that poses is in a storm surge, right? What does that do for all the toxicity from those heavy industries being washed ashore and into the neighborhood and into the areas? There hasn't been a significant study on the health risks posed by having heavy industry right on the waterfront. And there are 7 SMEAs throughout New York City. They're these circled in areas. Every single one, all 7 are in storm surge zones, and every single one is predominantly a community of color, right? So really an increased risk throughout our shores throughout New York. And the same is true, you see all the toxic waste facilities throughout New York, and really by and large, because of zoning laws, which gets a little complicated, they're housed in disproportionately lower income communities. So that's example number 2. And these examples are showing the ways in which we are already overburdening certain communities with our noxious facilities, with our chemical producing plants. But I think it's also important to talk about what happens post-storm, right? And so if we have inequities that exist prior to a storm, how we rebuild is likely going to be inequitable, right? And we've seen that as New York City has responded to Hurricane Sandy. So a good example here is the Rockaways. The Rockaways, so to oversimplify the dynamics on the Rockaways, the Atlantic beach side is getting and has been rapidly gentrified. It's become the wealthier part of the Rockaways, and it's predominantly white or more white than the other neighborhoods. Now, post-Sandy, Sandy came in and destroyed or really devastated the Rockaways. And one of the first things that the city did was rebuild the boardwalk on that Atlantic side. Spent something like $350 million to rebuild that boardwalk. And they did a cool design where it doubles as a storm surge barrier, where the wall of the boardwalk is backed by steel and concrete, so as to provide a wall for the next storm. That's on the Atlantic side, right? And they're doing ongoing beach nourishment as well. On the Jamaica Bay side, right behind it, they've done nothing, right? Absolutely nothing. And it's the predominantly Black neighborhoods throughout the Rockaways. Now, what's key here is that the Jamaica Bay side is equally as vulnerable to storm surge as the Atlantic side, right? So there's no difference in vulnerabilities, but the approach being taken by the city is incredibly inequitable, which makes sense considering the inequities that already exist. So I will kick it back to you, Mel, to now expand that out. There are environmental justice communities throughout this country, from here to New Orleans and coast to coast. And so I'm wondering your ideas on how we can alleviate, and you already started talking about it, the disproportionate impacts of climate change on communities of color, the overburdening of low-income communities with noxious facilities and things like this, and the environmental injustice faced by communities all over the country.
Right. And so, I mean, this is when it becomes interesting, right? Because, as you mentioned, like the city's making some of these decisions. At the same time, that federal dollars are at play in some capacity. And so I think that Congress really needs to be more proactive in the strings that are attached to funding moving forward, right? Because at this point, we know that a lot of the fixes that are happening are leaving communities of color to fend for themselves. And I actually had never seen that map before, and just seeing that disparity at the Rockaways is mind-numbing, right? But it's very real. And so being able to make sure that that there are racial impact studies to new developments that are coming in, right? To see where the proportion of need is, and ensuring that those communities are either included or first in line, to make up for the fact that historically they have been left out of the resource share and any type of new building. It can't, and this is part of the sort of, I think, overall challenge that we face in all of the policy schemes that we're talking about, because we even see it right now when we're talking about COVID, about, oh, well, there's an acceptable number of deaths because the economy needs to be put first. And I think that that's sort of the driving force behind a lot of our policy making these days, that is putting sort of economic interest ahead of policy outcomes. Right. If our policy outcome here is to make sure that we have, infrastructure in place that are keeping communities safe, but you're leaving half of a community out because it doesn't, it doesn't have all the shops, it doesn't have the beach located on it necessarily, or whatever the case may be. Right. I mean, the case is different, depends on where you are in the city. Then you're clearly failing at the overall policy outcome. And I think that the Congress needs to do not just better oversight, but understanding that, because we know that municipalities and states at the end of the day end up doing a lot of the implementation side of it, is putting in those safeguards in the policy designs that we're not just creating, but also in what the prerequisites are for the funding in the first place, and how that funding is to be allocated, and ensuring that that we know that this money is going to be distributed equitably, that it's going into projects that are going to have an equitable impact in communities both of color and as a whole.
Awesome. To follow up on this idea of economy, maybe it's I'd say somewhat related, is some local news that New York City, well, not so much news anymore, 2 years old, but New York City divested all its pension funds from fossil fuel holdings, which I think the de Blasio administration did, and that's a really significant win. I say the de Blasio administration, really, I mean the movements that were for years pressuring and organizing and performing to ensure that actually went through. But in addition to the pension fund withdrawal, at the same time, de Blasio initiated a lawsuit. The administration administered a lawsuit against the 5 largest oil companies for the $19 billion in damages that Hurricane Sandy did. And in the lawsuit named them a public enemy, right? Which I think is really important language, and really accurately names them, at least in my opinion. And in the lawsuit actually delineates probably the most important climate story in the last decade, which is that these companies knew for over half a century that their products were literally destroying the planet, and yet they started actively investing in climate denialism to mislead the public so that just a handful of executives could profit, right? And I think that is sociopathic. I mean, I think that the naming enemy of the public, there's no better definition for people who are literally putting the entire planet, every person, every species, and every future generation at risk for their own short-term profit. So now, while I am saying, there were some really cool things of the divestment and of the lawsuit, I think a lot of activists are also pushing for it to go further. And what I mean there is, so all of New York City's municipal money is held in 27 banks. Those banks are banks like JP Morgan Chase and Citibank and Wells Fargo and Bank of America, all of which are really actively funding the climate crisis. So I'll send that back to you however you want to respond. I think there are a lot of potential themes you could go. I think public banking, many activists are really excited about that idea. Yeah. I think divestment, social movements. You take it away.
Yeah, I mean, no, that's great, and I'm glad that you really connect the dots there, because I think obviously I'm running for office, so I'm looking at this as a candidate, and how we talk about our opponents and sort of politics in general, and we really make an emphasis on highlighting the donors that my opponent has, that include Goldman Sachs and sort of a lot of these bad actors, because they're not removed right? It's not like, oh, well, I like, not only are you just voting in their interest when you're in Congress, right? But they are playing an active role in funding the war machine. They're playing an active role in the environmental crisis. So you can't separate those things. These things come in tandem, and that's why it's so important. You know, I think divestment is something that it has to be part of the solution, because you can't have it both ways, right? Like, we can't say that we're for the environment and we're going to do environmental policy. Meanwhile, the organizations and the corporations that have all of the money and all of the incentive not to allow something like the Green New Deal to be fully realized are going to actively be working against us, right? I mean, we see that now in healthcare, right? I mean, now as Medicare for all becomes not such a crazy idea because it's a common sense solution, you have all the health insurance companies lobbying their brains out on the Hill right now, trying to make sure that doesn't happen, and asking for bailouts to make sure that they don't suffer through this crisis after their own failures. And that's sort of the same thing that we need to see happen at the federal level, where we're divesting, and then where we are again not making it so that municipalities are left with only these giant mega banks that again are actively working to enact policies that work against, you know, the communities, right? I mean, to put it plainly, you know, and I think that there's some really interesting stuff out there on public banking, specifically around being able to use the post office as to provide banking services, which I think is an interesting idea worth exploring. More importantly, it's really about making sure that these local banks are managed right by local actors who have a vested interest in what happens in that community, and that there is some community control and input, and not, you know, somebody that's just thinking about the bottom dollar, in which case, you know, what happens to a community comes second to profit.
Awesome. On a relatively similar note, in talking about energy, and I really appreciate your comments on the economy. Let me just pull it up, sorry. Where is it? Sorry for the pause here.
Oh, no worries.
Okay, so Columbia put this map out of New York City energy consumption. Really cool map. You can go block by block essentially and look at energy usage throughout New York City. It gives you the stats and all of that. So taking just a general approach at New York City, what we see is by far the most energy intensive place in New York is in Midtown, really the headquarters of corporate America within at least the context of New York City. Within just the center of Times Square, just those 7 blocks, more energy gets used than in the entire country of Sierra Leone for 3 years, right? Just 7 blocks for 1 year versus Sierra Leone for 3 years. And what we see throughout the city, and general trends here, but is that the wealthier communities and the whiter communities are using far more energy than the lower income communities and the communities of color, right? That's, again, broad strokes, not 100% true, but we see Brooklyn Heights and Forest Hills and so forth, right? So now this is true on a global level too. I mean, if you take a country like Bangladesh, in the next decade, it's estimated there's going to be 20 million climate refugees from that one country alone. And yet the average Bengali uses 1/50th per capita the amount of energy than the average American, right? Now that's true on a global and international level, but it's also very true within the microcosm of New York City, right? The communities who are going to be hardest hit are also the communities that are the least responsible for the crisis in the first place. So I'm going to, again, kick that back to you. And maybe, and you sort of touched on it, but talking about just energy justice and what transitioning off of fossil fuel away from the power of fossil fuels might look like.
Sure. And, you know, I'm a supporter of and DSA had a great forum earlier this year on public power. And I think that that's the direction that we need to be heading in. You know, nobody likes Con Ed was one of the great takeaways that I liked about it. And it was true. You know, we see ourselves, you know, and especially in more working class communities, getting faced with rate hikes, which we don't even know where they come from. There's no amount of transparency. Service is not any better. You still have people that end up losing power. And at the end of the day, we know that this is just not working. We know that this is not sustainable. And this is one of the things where I think we hit a roadblock in America in around policy making, where, you know, we just kind of double down on bad ideas. Right? Like that's what it feels like. It's like, you know, like we know that this is a huge detriment. We know that we need to be carbon neutral, and we spend more time poo-pooing any possible way out than actually investing in it. Because you're telling me if we didn't take away all of the fossil fuel industry subsidies and reinvested that in improving and developing newer technologies that will, I mean, give me a break, right? We have a rover on Mars right now. Like, we can figure this out. This is a choice that we're making. But we also need to make sure that that control is not, again, just in the hands of a select few, you know, corporate interests that are interested in making profit and not providing something that should be a right. Like, I mean, it's the 21st century, and this is a utility like any other. I know that you know, in some states people pay for water, and, you know, here in New York we're like, well, that's absurd. Like, that's a utility that comes out free. Well, so is electricity. We need this to live, and even right now that we're seeing how much we're reliant on technology just to be able to live our daily lives, you know, under this current crisis, further emphasizes why we need to make sure that we have accountability, transparency, and control of these utilities, where the public has a hand in the decision-making process, and in distributing needs, and being able to source new, reliable, renewable energies sources, instead of letting a handful of corporations make all of those decisions, and then we just deal with the after effects of it, which are never going to be good.
Wow, awesome. Cool. So I got just one more topic of conversation and question, and then if you have questions, please throw them in the chat, and then we'll get to it. So the final thing I'm hoping to talk to you about, and thanks again for all your answers and thought-provoking and hopeful policy solutions, and democratization is kind of like the thread that, the through line that's going through many of your answers, is needing to democratize. But I want to now come to an in-district. I've been talking about New York City whole for a while. And so what I want to talk about is the Flushing rezoning, but from a climate perspective. And so the context I'll give here is that in climate circles, there's this concept called managed retreat. Managed retreat is the idea that we need to begin moving our populations, our critical infrastructure, our cultural institutions away from shorelines, because we know what's going to happen, as we talked earlier. Now, this has already been done in New York. There's one neighborhood called Oakwood Beach in Staten Island, where after Hurricane Sandy hit and the neighborhood was devastated, about 450 homeowners came together, pretty conservative Staten Islanders, but they said, we don't need to see statistics. We don't need to, you know, we live the experience, and we don't want to rebuild here. So they petitioned the state for a buyout program. The state purchased the homes for $190 million. Demolished the homes. The Staten Islanders were relocated. And now that neighborhood's essentially just being left to go back to nature, right? So we already have our first climate refugees within New York City. That's already happened, and will continue to happen more intensely. So now that managed retreat is a controversial topic, and understandably so. I think asking people or forcing people to relocate, especially in the context of gentrification and colonialism and race, you know, that's a really sticky subject. And that's not necessarily what I'm putting on the table here. But what I will say is that as opposed to retreating from the shoreline, we're really doing the opposite. We in New York have a peculiar problem, which is that the real estate surrounding the shores are some of the most valuable real estate, not only in New York City, but in this entire country. So we are marching towards the coast. And if you think of every recent development project, right, you take the World Trade Center, you take the Hudson Yards, you take the Brooklyn Navy Yards, you take all the new luxury towers on the Williamsburg waterfront, or all the new luxury towers on Long Island City. You take Cornell University's new campus on Roosevelt Island, the Whitney Museum, the proposal for the Brooklyn Queens streetcar line from de Blasio, also being called the Gentrification Express line by some cynics and activists, right? But you have all this infrastructure where, in a time when we need to be thinking about how to remove from the coastline, it's all marching towards the coastline really at the pushing from the real estate industry. So within the context of this district, there is a rezoning happening in Flushing. It's a 13-tower rezoning 29 acres on Flushing Creek there. So I'm going to send that to you. And I think there are many places you could talk about. I know gentrification and housing are really important issues for you. So you're welcome to take it that direction. They're important for me too. I've done plenty of tours on gentrification in my time, but as well as, so housing and things like that, but also from a climate perspective, talking about rezoning in that location.
Sure, and I think that one of the big things that I think it was Assemblymember Kim was calling for was making sure that there was not just an environmental impact study, but also a racial impact study of what the new zoning was going to do, which I think is critical. And what I would love to see on the municipal level, 2021 candidates pay attention, is calling that that this be legislation at the city level for any type of new development that's coming in, because it's not, I think it's important for folks to think about gentrification not just as a racial component, but also thinking about what the economic component is, because the area of Flushing that's being rezoned and where we've been seeing this massive development happening over the past few years is really an immigrant community, a working class community that is getting displaced by newer immigrants, but that are at the wealthier end of the spectrum that can afford to live in these luxury places, and so that's obviously a huge problem. I mean, like there isn't even a nearby supermarket that's accessible, walking distance from a lot of these homes. I mean, we've taken a walking tour of that entire portion of the district, and it's just kind of mind-numbing when you see how much of it is just all of what used to be local shops are all now tile places and bathroom fixture places. It's just kind of feeding this development machine. But again, development is not something that is separate from the environment, right? I mean, they're building on a floodplain. We're talking about bringing in thousands of new units, which inevitably are going to bring more cars into an area that's second, in traffic density next to Times Square. And so this is backwards, right? Like these policies that don't happen in vacuums. And so it's, they say real estate is king in New York, but it's time to dethrone that king, because the realities are that, the environmental crisis is not being made up. There's going to be a real impact, and we have a choice to make. We can either kind of let things go as they are. We can let these buildings continue to displace folks. We can continue to let them have the negative impact on the environment in the short term, and then suffer the consequences later down the road. I mean, these are not, the short-term economic gains are not worth the long-term harm that is happening to our communities, to our infrastructure, to our economy too, because that is going to play out. It's an inevitability. And so I think that part of the Green New Deal has to include funding for municipalities to figure out how are we going to properly address this, right? Because yes, we understand that it's an industry, we understand that people need homes, but yeah, you know what? Like we need to address the seriousness of this crisis, and it's going to require spending on retrofits for existing buildings. It's going to require and until the technology becomes more ubiquitous, at some point we're going to have to pay more at the front end to make sure that any new construction that's coming into the city is to line with GND standards, so that we're not furthering or kicking the problem down the road. So I think that that's one of the biggest problems that I have with this massive development, is that it's not just going to displace immigrant communities. Is that it just seems like it doesn't make any sense in the context of the world that we are living in. It doesn't make sense for the area. And again, when in the face of a coming climate crisis that's already underway, we know that this is just going to add to the problem. It's just common sense that thousands of new units are going to bring need for public infrastructure that is not designed for that in that area.
Yeah, I think that is a really important part of it that you bring, right? If you bring thousands of people, you also need lots more schools and lots more grocery stores and where is the infrastructure to
right. And here's a public waterfront that now is going to be, because it was a brownfield, and that public dollars have gone into cleaning it up, and it's not going to be opened up to the public. I mean, they say it is, right, but you're going to have to work your way through this massive complex of private roads that are public.
Yeah.
Like that's how the developers like to call it. Oh, these are private roads that are public, and it's like that's not how this works. I mean, who decides who gets to use the waterfront? Like, why can't we, invest in refurbishing this area for public use? And I mean, obviously, it was bought out by private developers. That's something we have to deal with, but that's something that, again, moving forward, does this make sense, right? Do we always just turn and find private use of public land as the automatic thing to raise revenue instead of thinking about it in a larger policy context of like, these are the sort of the crises that we're facing. We're facing an affordability crisis in housing. We're facing an environmental crisis that's global. We have the ability, the wherewithal, and the resources to create the policy infrastructure in place now and start implementing that so that we don't have to wait for the bad thing to happen. We've just become a responsive government. We've become a responsive culture where, you know, we wait until we have to see the worst possible symptom of a problem before we start working on solutions, even though there are many of us that have been calling out these things coming down the pipe, and now they're here to bear, and we have to reason with them. So my hope is that we're able now to be more proactive, to get ahead of the curve, you know, to really tap to the resources that we have from community members, from organizations, from activists and issue area experts, to start working on the things that we know we need to be doing in order to not find ourselves in an even bigger mess down the road.
Great. I want to see if there are any questions. I'm not seeing anything in the chat. Mel, I know you said this is on Facebook Live, so did anything come through there?
And let me pop here and see if we have any questions on live. No, I think we're good on the question land. But but actually, I do have questions myself if I can tap your expertise. So, like, you know, like one of the challenges that I find is because of the Green New Deal, because we have to put everything into like a bumper sticker slogan, the average person really doesn't, I don't know that they understand like sort of the immensity of the challenge and all of the sort of the different facets. But just from your perspective, what are things that you think are an absolute must, like that, like this has to be a Green New Deal type of policy? Like what are the areas that are missing that like the federal government really should be able to step up and like provide some type of solution for?
Gosh, so my first context that I'd like to say is that I think a lot about the local context, and I don't think a ton about the federal context, right? I'm really immersed in local histories and policies through what I do with social justice tours. So often it's rare that I'm thinking local, federal. That said, we can look at what's happened locally, and I think some things have happened really successfully and some things have happened less successfully, right? But so on the local level, some things that I'm excited about: one, New York City declared a climate emergency. I think that is really important because, as you're saying, it's really hard for people to grasp just the immensity of this problem. And I think building consensus, there's no actual teeth there, but it's stating this happened before the pandemic, that we are in an emergency. And I think that sort of rhetoric is really important to at least start to get people on the same page. So that's one. You talked a bit about buildings coming in and all of this. So New York City passed the Climate Mobilization Act last year, maybe 2 years ago, which in New York City, in the context of New York, right, 2/3 of emitters are buildings. So I think that for our context, that is a really important step forward. And then the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, CLCPA, which passed, which says that New York City has to reduce by 2050, 85% of emissions, the largest in the country. I think those are really significant gains that have happened in New York City that I think can be replicated on the national model. With the CLCPA, there are plenty of flaws. And originally there was really strong social justice language about that a minimum of 40% of funding, green funding, would need to go into most impacted communities. The Cuomo administration was able to strip some of that language and cut it down to 35% and cut out some of the union promises that were guaranteed with the transition and all this sort of thing. But I think there are some really promising models beginning to come out of New York City. You also mentioned the Public Power Campaign, which is so thrilling that the DSA is putting together. It doesn't make sense. We didn't get into pipelines at all. There's some really important pipeline fights happening in New York City right now. The North Brooklyn pipeline is coming in and the Williams pipeline are coming in, which are whole episodes unto themselves. And I didn't cover that because they're too big in this talk. But and just people are realizing it doesn't make sense to have companies like this be for profit when we really desperately need to move away from fossil fuel infrastructure, right? So I think the public power model is a really intriguing model that folks are waking up to, as is, and which we talked about, the divestment model. It's happened in New York City. It has not happened in New York State, which I forget the number offhand, but billions and billions of dollars in pension funds and the rest of it. And of course, the connection to public banking as well. So I think there's plenty of really exciting models, really exciting things happening in this city and in this state that could potentially be replicated on a national scale. Did that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Oh, we also had a question. What role does participatory budgeting play in mitigating these issues?
Cool. You want to take that, or?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it plays an important one to the degree that, those are items that make it onto your local council members' docket. So, I think it is important. I think that what we end up seeing, though, whether it's participatory budgeting or whether it's like community boards, is that, we do lack some diversity at that level from folks in the communities, the times that these meetings end up happening and the amount of work. I mean, look, we've seen some outreach, at least around participatory budgeting, which I think is better. But, when you think about like the land use decisions, I mean, that was something that was happening at the CV level before we can even get to, whatever role budgeting may play in that prior to these developments happening. So I think that one of the things that I would say is that, it plays somewhat of a role, but the importance is to organize. And I say that obviously as an organizer, but when you see the public power campaign, most people don't know about it. They only know about it because somebody came to their door and knocked on it and started talking to them about, what they think about their energy bill, right? Or they got a phone call or an email. And so we have to continue to do that. I think it's super important, whether it's in an election year or not an election year, for folks to talk to their neighbors, to start, these things are important to each and every one of us. The environment's going to affect all of us. And you don't have to be an elected official in a position of power to make a difference. I think you have the ability to collectively organize your block, your building, your neighborhood, have these conversations with your neighbors. Like, this is how our democracy works. And we want to be able to make sure that, like, if we have something like public power, that those folks that are going to be able to have a say in making those decisions have been on the ground in these communities, working hand in hand to address these issues, that are intimately familiar with them, so that we don't end up replicating the mistakes that other efforts at implementing these models have made.
Yeah, I think that's a great ending point. One of my favorite elected officials in New York City, a guy named Jumaane Williams, public advocate, has a slogan that the best elected officials are activists. And I think that if you look at the history of social change in this city, this state, and this country, social change is driven by everyday people organizing with their neighbors to fight for a better world. So I'm really excited to hear that that's your perspective, even though you're running for Congress, or maybe it's because you're running for Congress that's yeah. So to wrap up, as said, many more topics. If you enjoyed tonight's conversation, me and Mel are having another conversation on May 14th. And that one it's going to be the 8:30, same time, Zoom. And it'll be the same format where I will give some local history or some local stories or contexts or concerns, and then send it over to Mel for larger considerations. Mel, the topic is going to be on the economy. I'll focus on income inequality, and I think one of the most important histories in the city, in really the modern era, is the history of the bankruptcy in New York and the neoliberal reforms that came in and were ushered in after. So I'll spend a lot of time on that history, and then we can widen it out to a federal context. So that's next time. And I know, Mel, you wanted to.
Yeah, so the 13th, the day before that, we'll be doing a town hall on mass incarceration and talking about criminal justice reform. We have some awesome folks to talk us through that one. So until then, we'll see you on the 14th, where we can keep talking about environmental justice and the economy. And for folks that, if this is your first time seeing us, www.melforprogress.com. Learn more about the campaign, why we're running on a progressive platform, and the need for change in NY-6. Until next time, thank you very much. And thank you again, Dan.
Yeah, thank you. Really nice talking.
You too, brother. Take care.